Happy holidays, everyone. It's Nancy Miller. And if you're like me, sometimes the week of these busy holidays can trigger a bit of insomnia. In between, of course, all of the good tidings and comfort and joy. So I thought, just in case anyone was struggling, trying to get a good night's sleep, I would unlock a bonus episode from this past May, which also happens to be my personal favorite of the episodes I created for Dead Sleep this year. In this episode, you will hear about my own personal obsession with a certain documentary series called The Staircase, one of true crime's most famous sagas, and, in my opinion, the gold standard in true crime storytelling. I will be back next week with the December bonus episode. So if you like what you hear tonight, and you would like to support the podcast and ensure you get the bonus episodes each month, you can subscribe, as always, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Patreon. But please, consider this episode my little holiday treat for you. Until next week, happy holidays and nighty-night. Welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. It's Nancy, and thank you so much for subscribing to this podcast. And for this May bonus episode, we will be revisiting a famous, maybe the most famous, French true crime docuseries, The Staircase. And since this is a French docuseries, it seems apropos to start with a little French lesson, a French phrase that everyone should know. And that French expression is l'esprit de l'escalier, the spirit of the stairway. And that phrase, l'esprit de l'escalier, is a very fancy French phrase for a very Larry David dilemma, a universal predicament of when you have an argument with someone and you only think of the right thing to say, the mot juste, the clapback, after you've walked away. And I'm pretty sure more than once, many of us have stayed awake, feeling angry, thinking of the thing that we should have said, and planning that tomorrow we're going to go back and we're going to recreate that moment so that we can say what we should have said. Except the moment has passed. It's too late. The spirit of the stairs, of missing the opportunity to say the thing that you wish you had said, is one of the most maddening things about being human. And it's also the inspiration for tonight's episode. So you might think of tonight's episode as My l'esprit de l'escalier de l'escalier. The spirit of all of the things that I wish I could have said about the staircase when I was working on a whole podcast about the staircase for HBO Max a few years ago. Because when I finished that project, I had so many things that I wish I could talk about because there were things I hadn't thought of before. And it was too late. The show was over. And for a while I thought, that time has passed. You need to move on. The amount of information you've seen and heard and now know about the staircase, the documentary, and the real case around the staircase, it's overwhelming. It's too much. It's incoherent. It's impossible to follow. At best, people are confused. At worst, you put people to sleep. Put people to sleep. And now here we are, where I have a podcast where I tell true crime stories that are supposed to put people to sleep. So this is, without a doubt, the most meandering, fatiguing, densely packed, kind of messy, completely exhausting episode of Dead Sleep maybe ever. In journalism, there's something called being too close. It's often what an editor tells a writer when they've gone way too deep into something and they get really defensive about it, and it doesn't always make sense because they know too much and they are too close. As a longtime editor and writer, I've been on both sides. And without a doubt, with The Staircase, I am too close. And I'm usually very detailed and perfectionistic with the way that I edit and shape my stories, but this one's just going to have to be the way it's going to be. Long and shaggy. So if you're looking for a tight, efficient, true crime tale, this isn't the episode. This is like the true crime insomniac staring at the ceiling, desperate to go to sleep special. And I will link to all of the iterations from the original documentary to the Max series to the companion podcast that I hosted. And now I'm revisiting it as a Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime May bonus episode. This is my one chance, really. Because this spring, it turns out, marks the 20th anniversary, that's 20 years, since The Staircase first premiered in the United States, all the way back in 2005. That's when I first saw it. And while 2005, it seems like a long time ago, the scope of The Staircase is more relevant now than ever. I recently watched A Body in the Snow, the trial of Karen Reed. And as I watched that documentary, I thought, this is Michael Peterson and The Staircase all over again. A charismatic, on-camera suspect telling their version of events. And how that version of events can look so different to two different groups of people. That to one group of people, this tragic incident is obviously a murder. But to a whole other group of people, it's a mystery. Maybe even a conspiracy. And somewhere in the middle of all this, it's the rest of us, people who are just watching, and our opinions, we can change them depending on who's talking on screen. But what agitates all of us is the threat of injustice. But what is justice? That is the question that every single person at the center of this episode will spend a long time fighting over. A murder case and a trial that would be chronicled over the next 13 years in 13 episodes of the French documentary series called The Staircase. Now, obviously, you know my feelings about The Staircase, but it's fair to say, without question, the most influential documentary series of the 21st century. A series that transformed the whole notion of true crime on television from tacky tabloid infotainment to gripping and masterfully crafted storytelling. A murder trial that unfolded exquisitely, one episode after the next. We see the influence of The Staircase everywhere. In every docuseries. From that first overhead establishing drone shot to the use of a dramatic, classical underscore, like a mournful, lilting cello. And the most groundbreaking part of it all was a shift in POV. A crime series, a real-life murder case told from the perspective of the suspect an accused killer we found ourselves rooting for. Here it was a charismatic and complicated Michael Peterson, a man many of us felt like we knew, and found ourselves by the end of the staircase feeling sympathy for, even protective of. As he and his adoring adult children navigated the perplexing and maddening machinations of a murder trial. And from that very first episode, when it premiered here in the United States in 2005, all the way up until it found a whole new audience on Netflix as the story continued across 13 episodes and 13 years, well, we followed it all. For many of us who largely knew this story from the staircase, the mystery always remained. Did Michael Peterson really kill Kathleen, the 48-year-old wife, mother, and successful executive who was found at the bottom of a narrow staircase in the Peterson home in the wee morning hours of December 9th, 2001? Or was this all some horrific, tragic mistake? Many of us have wondered for years what really happened. And look, I'm here to tell you, we will never know the truth, because no one does, except Kathleen Peterson and arguably Michael Peterson. And unless he makes some sort of surprise confession now that he's in his early 80s, despite taking that Alford plea in 2017, Michael Peterson maintains his innocence. But here's the thing about the Peterson case and the staircase. That justice here wouldn't be about what really happened. Like a lot of true crime, this case wasn't even about the truth. Inside that courtroom, the case was about who could tell the better story. And whoever told the best story, they'd win. Or so it seemed. Because long after the trial, the release of the staircase, it added a whole new layer of suspicion. Quite literally, in France, where it was first released, the title of the staircase, it's not the staircase. In France, it was titled Soupçon. That's S-O-U-P with a C with a little squiggle on the bottom. That's a soft S sound. O-N, soupçon. And that means suspicion, like a shadow of doubt. Only the shadow of doubt in the staircase. The doubt wasn't explicitly with Michael Peterson. There was a shadow of doubt cast over this whole case and how it was handled by the North Carolina prosecutors. And for those of us who knew this murder trial exclusively from watching The Staircase, a lot of us believed, guilty or not guilty, Michael Peterson did not receive a fair trial. That there were too many variables, there was reasonable doubt. Before Citizen Detective read, The Staircase fired up the first neurons of our true crime brains. And with The Staircase, I, for one, for a long time believed it was entirely plausible that Kathleen Peterson was attacked and maybe killed by a wild, giant, barred owl. And I know I'm definitely not alone in believing what's called the owl theory. And at that time, I guess I preferred to imagine that a wild animal was capable of killing someone rather than believe it was a person, someone close to the victim, someone like Michael Peterson, who seemed, at least on screen in The Staircase, like such a nice guy, and most important, such a good dad. And then in 2022, as I said, I got a job hosting the companion podcast to The Staircase. That's the version that was made for HBO Max. It was a dramatization of the original documentary series, and it was created by director Antonio Campos. Antonio knew everything about this case and had been trying to get this made into a film, a feature film, since 2009. And I guess it's good that Antonio had to wait, because there were so many developments in this case. And in the meantime, Antonio Campos would go on to direct an incredible film, chilling film, based on the true story of a TV reporter named Christine Chubbuck, who, as you may know, in the early 1970s, performed an unthinkable and gruesome act, taking her own life on live television. The testimony of his talent is how he handles that in this film, which is called Christine, and it came out in 2016. And Antonio and the writers who made that film would go on to get the green light to make the crime drama version, an episodic series of The Staircase for Max. Antonio had the blessing, at least at first, of many of the real people involved in the original documentary. This included the famous lawyer David Rudolph, filmmaker Jean-Xavier de Lestrade, and even the apparent approval of Michael Peterson, though later he would disavow the whole thing, which we'll get to later in this episode. Now, my job as host of the companion podcast was largely to interview the cast, the actors who were playing these real-life people. I interviewed Colin Firth, who played Michael Peterson, Toni Collette, who played Kathleen Peterson, Michael Stuhlbarg, who played David Rudolph. And with the exception of Colin Firth, who played Michael Peterson, who had to decide for himself whether or not he believed Michael Peterson did it, he wouldn't actually reveal that to me or to anyone. Not even the director, who told Colin Firth to keep it to himself. It's something that you have to decide for yourself as you watch him on screen in the final 30 seconds of the series. But other than Colin Firth, the people that I interviewed, they didn't know whether or not Michael Peterson had murdered Kathleen. And along with that, in the creators of the show, I interviewed some real-life experts, including my one-time hero, Larry Pollard. That's Peterson's neighbor, who was the first to come up with the owl theory. And when I interviewed him in 2022, Larry Pollard maintained his owl theory. And one of the biggest reasons was because he just couldn't believe that a guy like Michael Peterson, someone he thought he knew, would ever have killed Kathleen. And along with all of that, I also got my hands on an enormous amount of research material. And just when I thought I'd seen the staircase from every single angle, I realized I hadn't. I'd missed something. And that would come to light in a revealing interview with Parker Posey, who embodied the role of the staircase's most controversial figure, a Durham County Assistant District Attorney named Freda Black. Now, Parker Posey these days is best known for her role as the pill-popping Southern matron in the series White Lotus. But before that, she showcased that same Durham drawl when she played the on-screen version of Freda Black, better known by many as the Dragon Lady. And with the case of Michael Peterson, Freda Black was a Dragon Lady who breathed fire all over Michael Peterson's defense, torching his whole image of devoted husband, soulmate, a man who was lost without his wife Kathleen. And along the way, she came off as pretty vicious, rather callous, and more than a little homophobic. When, as you might recall, Freda Black paraded around during Michael Peterson's trial, showing the jury images found on Michael Peterson's computer, homoerotic imagery she described as pure tea filth. And if you judge her solely on her courtroom performance, I would put Freda Black right up there with Ken Kratz from Making a Murderer as true crime's greatest villains and most despised DAs. But who was Freda Black really, beyond the scope of the staircase? Well, Parker Posey is one of those performers who does a ton of research on a character. And in my interview with her, she revealed a side of Freda Black, the real Freda Black, that we didn't really see on screen. And after that, I was inspired to revisit this whole case through the one side of the story that we never really got. The staircase through the heavily mascaraed, smoky eyes of Freda Black. A fresh way of looking at a familiar case from the perspective of its greatest villain. And back in 2022, I had hoped to interview Freda Black and get her whole side of this saga. But I couldn't. I can't. Because Freda Black died a tragic and untimely death in 2018, just a little over a month after the re-release of The Staircase, at the age of just 57. So what happened to Freda Black after the Michael Peterson case? How did she go from firebrand to tragic figure? And what role did Michael Peterson's case and The Staircase play in her downfall and early demise? A casualty, perhaps, of what happens when true crime and real life collide. Now, The Staircase, it doesn't actually start with the murder of Kathleen Peterson, December 9th, 2001. It starts with a desire to make a documentary, which means it starts in Paris, France, in a little brasserie, a relaxed restaurant, in the winter of 2002, where two Frenchmen sat and drank and talked and searched and searched and searched for a killer. Not just any killer. This was their killer. Well, an alleged killer. A murder suspect. Someone they'd transform into their next subject as the star, the hero, or was it the anti-hero, of an upcoming true crime documentary they wanted to make. Because this next project, this next film, was going to be one for the ages, a masterpiece. That's what this slim, pale, 39-year-old French filmmaker Jean-Xavier de Lestrade aspired to make. After his previous documentary, called Murder on a Sunday Morning, which we chronicled in the previous episode, had won international attention and an Academy Award. And for his follow-up, Jean and his producer, an extroverted, ruddy-cheeked 54-year-old filmmaker named Denis Poncet, they were now on the hunt for not a sequel to Murder on a Sunday Morning, more like its flip side. Murder on a Sunday Morning exposed the ugliest side of the American criminal justice system, how an innocent black teenager of modest means in Florida was physically and mentally coerced into confessing to a crime he didn't commit, and would have likely spent the rest of his life in prison until a public defender came along and exposed the horror of what had happened, and most important, a jury determining, ultimately, that this teenager was not guilty. And Jean and Denis were still fascinated by the American criminal justice system, because to them it was so starkly different than the one in France. That here in the United States, the criminal justice system was structured to be adversarial, which meant there were just two opposing sides, the prosecution and the defense, and the judge would oversee the integrity of the process, and a 12-person jury would ultimately decide the outcome, guilty or not guilty. With this next film, which they initially imagined as a feature-length documentary, they wanted to show the other side of the spectrum. What did the American system look like when a suspect was at the top of society's food chain? What would a similar criminal trial, that is a high-profile murder case, what would it look like if you had the means and the money to afford the best lawyers, the best experts? Jean and Denis wanted to follow all sides, the point of view of the prosecutors, the judge, and the defense. But the first thing they had to do was choose their case. They had to find the perfect murder. Now, some might think of what they did next as cold-blooded. But for months, Jean and Denis scoured through hundreds and hundreds of murder cases to find just the right victim, just the right suspect, just the right place. And for them, this was necessary and strategic. Documentaries come down to people, and they had to find the right people, characters really, that audiences would want to watch, with a story arc that could sustain a feature-length documentary. And after sifting through roughly 300 possible options over those many months, they found their perfect case. One that began with the perfect couple, who appeared to have it all. A 10,000 square foot mansion in the nicest part of Durham, North Carolina. A seemingly happy marriage until the shocking events that night in December destroyed everything. Now, the details around what happened that night in December of 2001, Jean and Denis didn't know. At the time, when they were approaching David Rudolph and Michael Peterson about covering the trial, they knew what everyone else knew. How, after 2 hysterical phone calls to 911, the first responders arrived just before 3 in the morning to find Kathleen Peterson at the bottom of the stairs. And what struck them first, what shocked them, is what strikes everybody first about this case. That Kathleen Peterson was not only dead. When she was found at the bottom of that staircase, she was saturated in blood. And they soon called in this incident, not as an accidental fall, but as a possible homicide. And since that moment, Michael Peterson was seen as the suspect. Now, when the French filmmakers got involved and reached out to David Rudolph and Michael Peterson, neither Michael nor David had ever heard of anything like this before. Not many people had. There was, of course, Errol Morris and his documentaries, and there was court TV, there was Cops, there was reality television. But there wasn't really anything like this. A crew basically embedding themselves into the life of Michael Peterson, essentially living at his house for months and months and months, seeing this whole trial through from beginning to end. For David Rudolph, this was an opportunity to showcase his incredible skills as a criminal attorney. And maybe he'd finally make it as a top lawyer featured on the cover of a magazine. And for Michael Peterson, undoubtedly the fact that these filmmakers were French, he found appealing. He and Kathleen had always hoped to retire in Paris. And of course that dream was now long gone. He also likely presumed, correctly, that these French filmmakers wouldn't be as shocked or judgmental about the recent revelation that Michael Peterson was bisexual. For a documentarian, this was narrative gold. If Jean and Denis thought they were going to get a simple story about how a rich man paid his way out of a murder trial, the reality would be far more complicated. So by February of 2002, Jean-Xavier de Lestrade, Denis Ponce, and their film crew made their way to Durham, North Carolina. And by the time the French film crew arrived in February of 2002, by then Michael Peterson had already turned himself in, been charged with first-degree murder, and was out on a sizable bond as he awaited trial. That wouldn't begin until 18 months later, July of 2003. And in the meantime, there was a lot of documentary to make for David Rudolph and Michael Peterson and the legal team. There was a lot of defense to build. And for the prosecution, there would be not one, but 2 homicides to prove. Now, for their vision of a balanced documentary, Jean and Denis wanted to feature all sides, tell the story from the perspective of the defense, the prosecution, even the judge. And when they came to Durham, North Carolina at first, the prosecutors agreed that it seemed like something they'd like to do. At the very least, they were willing to appear on camera for some interviews, and you can see them in the first episode. Most notably, District Attorney Jim Hardin and his team gleefully announcing that they know that Michael Peterson is guilty. But soon enough, it became apparent, at least to District Attorney Jim Hardin, that if these French guys were working with Michael Peterson's legal team and the prosecution, there would be a conflict of interest, with the risk of filmmakers sharing information with the defense. And in turn, the filmmakers were afraid that the prosecution was going to demand that they turn over their material. Beginning with the fact that they were accusing Michael Peterson of beating his wife to death, and they had no murder weapon. But Jim Hardin reasoned that maybe they didn't need the murder weapon, because what he had was his not-so-secret weapon. His diamond-tough, obsidian-sharp, human blade, Freda Black. In 2002, as this case came together, Freda Black was nearing the top of her game, already earning herself a reputation as a strong prosecutor in an industry that was largely dominated by men. But Freda, she was used to being one of the guys. Even her name, that's Freda, F-R-E-D-A, versus the more common female name Frida, was because her father apparently wanted a boy. Or so the story goes, that when she was born, he gave her a boy's name and just tacked an A on at the end. Freda. Freda offset her boyish name with a distinctly feminine look that was almost doll-like. And the effect was like a cross between Snow White and the Wicked Queen all in one. With dark black hair she wore pinned back, and a wardrobe filled with bright, cheery dresses with ruffles and bows and flowers and large collars, but with a vampy style of makeup, dark purple eyeshadow, red lipstick, and eyebrows that formed 2 thin, high arches that telegraphed Freda Black's every emotion in the courtroom, which in this case with Michael Peterson, those emotions were mostly disbelief and disgust. Because Michael Peterson, he killed his wife, and he had the audacity to think he was going to get away with it. And Freda wasn't going to let that happen. Freda Black likely recognized that she and Kathleen Peterson had a few things in common. They were both working mothers and breadwinners. Freda was also divorced and took care of her 2 young daughters. Kathleen had her biological daughter, Caitlin, 19, from her first marriage, along with the blended family she shared with Michael. His 2 sons, Clayton and Todd, who were then in their 20s. And then there were the two girls, Margaret and Martha, who were then both in college. The girls who were orphaned after the death of their mother, that's Elizabeth Ratliff, back in Germany, when Michael took them in, and Kathleen raised as her own. Kathleen and Michael actually met because of their daughters. The families were actually neighbors in Durham, North Carolina. And it was their children, Kathleen's daughter Caitlin, and Martha and Margaret. They were all close in age and played together, constantly. Michael and Kathleen grew closer, and somewhere in the late 1980s, they established a romantic connection, eventually moving in together and getting married. And like Freda, Kathleen had to make enormous sacrifices, a balancing act between her life and her career. Both women were highly respected in their work. Kathleen was a high-level executive at a communications company called Nortel. Freda had an excellent track record prosecuting big murder cases, capital murder cases, and they both excelled in school and broke barriers for women their whole lives. Especially Kathleen, who was one of the first female students to be accepted into Duke's engineering program. And she received 2 master's degrees. And they were both extroverts, women who loved to have a good time and were known for celebrating with a cocktail or two. And they were always there for those who needed them. With Kathleen, that was her children and her colleagues. And for Freda, those were the victims and their families. They also shared a philosophy that when they had problems, you didn't talk about it, you didn't dwell on your problems. You picked yourself back up and you stayed busy. You'd figure it out one way or another. And now, with Kathleen gone, Freda would be very busy, trying to uncover what exactly Kathleen's problems were and how they led to her death. And she discovered pretty quickly Kathleen's #1 problem. It was her lying, cheating, murderous husband, Michael Peterson. Freda knew best-selling author, former columnist Michael Peterson thought he was pretty clever. And maybe he had a big French film crew conned as they filmed him sitting in his study, puffing on a pipe, quoting Shakespeare. But she knew, like any murderer, he was just blowing smoke. But Freda, she was a veteran prosecutor, and she'd handled some of the grisliest, most brutal murder cases that North Carolina had ever seen. Early in her career, she actually worked for the public defender's office, hoping she might make a difference. But right away, Freda's workload as a public defender was brutal, and she was under pressure to clear a backlog of criminal cases. And the outcome wasn't just defeating. For her defendants, the consequences were devastating. There was this one case where Freda Black was assigned an assault case involving a teenage boy accused of hitting someone with an axe. Now, this boy swore it was self-defense. But Freda Black only had 7 hours to put this whole kid's case together. And claiming self-defense, that would take time and resources and investigation to prove. Time that she and the defendant really didn't have. And instead of going to trial, she recommended that this kid take a plea deal. In her mind, likely, it was a good move. 2 years instead of 20 years. And not long after his release, when he was just 18 years old, this kid, his name is Daniel Green, was arrested in connection with the murder of Michael Jordan's father, James Jordan Sr., who was killed while taking a nap in his Lexus in 1993. And with that serious murder charge, having that felony conviction, that assault that he said he didn't do, that he served time for, they had an opportunity to pursue the death penalty in this case. By then, Freda Black was working for the district attorney's office. She was now under fire from the public defender's office for essentially steering Daniel Green into taking this deal. It was a plea deal he said he never wanted, for a crime he said he didn't commit, and now here it was potentially going to be used against him to support the most extreme penalty one can get in the United States. Now, this case with Daniel Green and the murder of Michael Jordan's father, it's much more complicated. But in the end, Daniel Green received a life sentence in prison. And Freda Black received a life lesson that every case has consequences. And decisions that were made years earlier would be scrutinized in a far harsher light down the road. By joining the district attorney's office, maybe she could help on the other side, knowing that she was putting legit bad guys away. In fact, there was a case from her past that had a lot of striking similarities to Michael Peterson's case. In the mid-1990s, Freda Black successfully prosecuted a man named Isaac Jackson Stroud. Stroud, like Peterson, was accused of violently killing his significant other, a school teacher named Jocelyn Mitchell. And like Michael Peterson, Isaac Stroud also had called 911, telling the dispatcher that his girlfriend, Jocelyn, she'd collapsed, and he wasn't sure what was wrong with her, but they had to come quickly while she was still breathing. And yet, when the EMTs arrived, Jocelyn had no pulse. And what's more, her arms and legs were stiff, suggesting rigor mortis settling in. And the medical examiner later estimated that Jocelyn Mitchell had been dead for 6 or 7 hours before Isaac had called the police. Now, there was ample evidence of blunt force trauma, injuries all over Jocelyn's body. But her cause of death was hypoxia, a deprivation of oxygen to crucial cells like lung tissue, which caused her to lose consciousness, slip into a coma, and then slowly die an agonizing and horrible death. A death described as torture. And Freda Black and her boss, Jim Harden, ensured that his death would also be torture. When he was found guilty, he was given the death penalty. And in yet another very complicated case, that death sentence was commuted in 2011. By comparison, the murder case against Michael Peterson was her least problematic. Sure, there was no murder weapon, but for Freda, this wasn't the toughest case she'd ever fought. And it wasn't even the most complicated. In the eyes of Freda Black, Michael Peterson's case was no mystery. Sadly, it was all too common. And when the trial began in July of 2003, it was obvious that David Rudolph was going to marshal in all kinds of experts and introduce all kinds of evidence, trying to establish some type of cockamamie story that somehow she'd fallen down the stairs. But Freda Black knew from the very beginning, from that first 911 call, from the first video footage that went through that house, and the evidence that was pulled from his computer, that David Rudolph can try and make this case complicated, but it wasn't. This was a case that came down to just two things: blood and lies. And in the life of Michael Peterson, those two things, blood and lies, they were everywhere. From a distance, the white mansion with black shutters was brimming with holiday cheer that December night. Each window at the front of the house aglow with soft white Christmas lights and a pine cone-studded Christmas wreath hanging on the front door. A wreath so big, the ambulance driver missed the house because it obscured the number, 1810 Cedar. And with the arrival of that ambulance, the soft glow of that light was interrupted by the red strobe of disaster and the flashing blue of police cars as Durham authorities made sense of what was now a crime scene. One that you could see from beginning to end in a grainy and wobbly handheld video tour through the home of 1810 Cedar, when a Durham investigator was recording everything he saw early that morning. And in that video, it starts with the pathway leading up to the Petersons' home. That's that 10,000 square foot, massive 5-bedroom, 6-bathroom colonial-style mansion. And in that massive property is one of the most eye-catching features, that right when you walk through that front door, there's a grand, sweeping spiral staircase. A staircase for dramatic moments, like something out of Gone with the Wind. But that wasn't where Kathleen was. Kathleen was at the bottom of the other staircase. A tiny, desolate, narrow, steep set of stairs off of the kitchen. Stairs that were once used as an automated lift to carry someone in a wheelchair to and from the second floor. Those stairs were steep, and the space was tight, with a hard turn, close to the bottom. Absolutely the kind of stairs you could lose your footing and stumble down. But that's not what first responders said they saw. This wasn't a stumble. If this was an accident, a fall down the stairs, there would have been broken bones, a broken hip, some deep bruising on her body, especially if she stood up and fell again. There'd be bruising on her backside. Instead, it was just blood. Blood on her face, in her hair, in her clothes, on the bottoms of her feet, coming from some type of laceration. Lacerations that were on her head and her face. And that's what the jury would need to see, up close, those injuries. The prosecution, that's Freda and her boss Jim Harden, needed the jury to understand. All of these lacerations, they suggested a struggle, not a fall. Freda had the files, right there in her prosecution's evidence folder. A body diagram, a line drawing that showed the front and back of a head, annotated by the medical examiner. On Kathleen's face alone, there were nearly a dozen contusions. That's cuts and bruises visible just above both eyes, and 2 bruises on her nose, one on the bridge and one just beneath it. There was a chipped front tooth, number 10, the one located just to the right of the front teeth, along with bruising on her right ear, and maybe most illuminating and potentially overlooked was the abrasion on the right side of her neck. An injury that wasn't fatal, but offered the possibility for the jury to imagine what the prosecution believed happened that night. That Michael and Kathleen had gotten into some kind of disagreement, and Michael launched a physical attack, focusing his frenzied efforts on her neck first and then escalating his violent behavior with some weapon, be it that blowpoke or another kind of object. Whatever it was that left those horrible lacerations, It ultimately led to what medical experts called an ischemic event, which meant a blockage or an interruption of blood flow to the brain, which rendered Kathleen unconscious, and eventually her brain and body shut down. A violent and long and agonizing death. One that the prosecution asserted that Michael Peterson thought he could cover up by cleaning up. But Michael Peterson had never cleaned up anything in his life. He only knew how to make messes, which explained, at least to investigators, why Kathleen's head was propped up on a blood-drenched towel. Michael Peterson said he was trying to help his wife, to stop the bleeding and bring her comfort. But to others, the experts, it looked like what he was trying to do was use those towels to clean up his mess, which only led to an even bigger mess, as the slippery blood just smeared across the walls of the staircase. And this failed effort took so long, and Michael Peterson failed so miserably, that by the time he called the police, the blood was nearly dry. And those 911 calls were Michael Peterson, who'd written entire books about being in combat, about seeing men getting killed. And yet, in the moment, when it came to being courageous enough to help his wife, he was helpless, frozen, whimpering. It was a surprise, to say the least, especially given his previous experience. That other woman from Michael Peterson's past, who was also found lifeless and bloody at the bottom of the stairs. And in Fred's view, it was up to the district attorney's office to treat that so-called coincidence, the death of Elizabeth Ratliff, which was then believed to be natural causes, a brain aneurysm that led to a tumble down the stairs, that Martha and Margaret's biological mother found 16 years earlier. It would be wrong to not look into it. To Freda, this wasn't prejudicial. It was long overdue detective work. This was evidence of Michael Peterson's dark past. Whatever the specifics were of how Liz Ratliff ended up at the bottom of that staircase in Germany, what was most striking was Michael Peterson's reaction to that incident compared to his reaction to Kathleen's death. Back in the 1980s, with the staircase death of Liz Ratliff, Michael stepped up and controlled the whole situation. From touching her body to ensure she was dead, to covering the body before the police came, to leading the communication with the neighbors and police, explaining what happened. That it was a brain aneurysm. And then traveling with Liz Ratliff's remains from Germany to Texas for her funeral. And along with that, ensuring all of her personal and financial details were handled quickly, drawn directly from a copy of her will that he thoughtfully brought with him. This version of Michael Peterson was courageous and proactive. But with Kathleen, he was so distraught he couldn't even try to save her life. Unable to perform CPR, unable to do anything but clutch her body, unwilling to let go. And even the most basic medical information about Kathleen that the EMTs asked about, so they could understand the nature of her injuries, Michael just looked past them, as if in a daze. And there was a pettiness to this cowardice. After Kathleen's body was taken away, Michael refused to even look at that staircase, which was understandable at first. But as her funeral approached, he left it up to Candace, Kathleen's sister, to clean up the blood on the wall before family arrived at the house. As for the actual funeral services, Michael also delegated that task to other people. Kathleen's sisters planned everything, from the eulogies to the flowers. And for her burial, he left that decision up to Caitlin, Martha, and Margaret to choose the plot of land where their mother would be buried. The only proactive thing Michael did for Kathleen's funeral was fire off an angry email to Candace afterwards, complaining about how she'd spent too much money on all of those flowers. Kathleen's favorites were roses. But roses were expensive. But these were just little things, hearsay, stories about his bad behavior, usually said by people who couldn't stand Michael Peterson, like Kathleen's sisters. But then there were the other things, the falsehoods, the fiction that Michael crafted about himself over the years. Like how, back in Germany, in the 1980s, he told people that he worked for the CIA, that he went on top-secret missions in Eastern Europe and Africa, and that while in Vietnam, he'd earned not one but 2 Purple Hearts. Michael was a gifted writer and brilliant with inventing details, but not much else. He portrayed an image that he was a man of honor, when in truth, Michael was rarely gainfully employed, living off of his first wife Patty's schoolteacher salary. And when short on funds, Michael stole money from friends, including withdrawing roughly $1,000 from one neighbor and trying to pin it on the babysitter. Freda had to laugh at how Michael was so self-important that he even accused the DA, actually all of Durham, of some kind of conspiracy, that he was somehow such a threat that they had to have him arrested and were going to railroad him for murder and lock him away forever. When in reality, Michael wasn't some hard-nosed journalist devoting time and talent to exposing Durham's corruption. He was more like a cranky, vanity columnist who would end up paying newspapers to run his columns. He was kind of a town crank. If Michael were poor, they'd call him weird, but he was rich, so they called him eccentric. But it wasn't Freda's job to launch any character assassinations. She didn't need to. There were a whole team of experts, the best and brightest in North Carolina, who'd made discoveries, who'd found evidence about what happened to Kathleen Peterson and Michael Peterson's involvement based on years of experience. From medical examiner Deborah Radish to the expert blood analyst from the State Bureau of Investigations, Dwayne Deaver. And in the courtroom, Freda challenged the notion that any one of these experts would lie. Why would they lie? Blood doesn't lie. Now, in the courtroom and in the staircase, there was quite a bit of time spent looking at the death of Elizabeth Ratliff. But there was another mysterious death, one not mentioned in the documentary or in the court case, a story that no one in the Peterson family liked to talk about. Because before there was Kathleen, there was Clancy. Now, this is a tough story, so I'll tell it as gently as I can. Clancy was one of the 4 Peterson family's purebred English bulldogs, and he was maybe the biggest and silliest and most playful. Clancy was 4 years old and 70 pounds, and his favorite thing was playing in the Peterson swimming pool. And one afternoon, when Kathleen's sisters, that's Candace and Lori, and their kids were at the Petersons' house at the pool, Clancy was playing in the pool. And when he grabbed a pool hose in his mouth and started pulling it across the water, Clancy accidentally broke some piece of plastic pool equipment. No one had really noticed, until somehow Michael appeared out of nowhere, red-faced and screaming angry. And Michael ran to the pool, yanked all 70 pounds of Clancy from that water, and it's hard to say this, but Michael beat Clancy repeatedly with that broken piece of pool equipment. And he hit the dog over and over in the face as the dog cried and tried to get away. And he only let up when Margaret, who family members all say was Michael's favorite, when Margaret begged her father to stop. The dog was bloody, but his injuries didn't require a vet's attention. But the incident, It was shocking. Even more shocking was when, sometime afterwards, Clancy was found floating alone and lifeless in the family swimming pool. And when the kids discovered Clancy, Michael said the dog must have had a heart attack and drowned. The event was so traumatic that Kathleen refused to talk about it, ever. But what happened to Clancy, it haunted Kathleen's sisters, who later recalled the incident in a book by Diane Fanning called Written in Blood. Now, that specific story, it's part of a dark family lore, and it never made its way into a courtroom. But plenty of other incriminating things would. And Freda, of course, made a point of mentioning Michael Peterson's extramarital activities to the jury in her closing statements. And this is when she held the pages of pornographic material depicting men every which way and describing it as pure tea filth. And I have read Freda Black's closing statement, the one she made to the jury, 10 times. And it's fair to say what she did was establish that Michael Peterson was lying. That he said that his wife knew all about his affairs. His wife knew when he was going to the gym for 3.5 hours a day while she was at work, that he was having a whole other different workout somewhere deep in a sauna. And in the end, Freda was right. Michael Peterson later revealed he was lying, that Kathleen knew. Well, the way that he framed it was, he never told her, but that she might have known intuitively, but it was left unspoken. And for Freda Black, that day in October was one of the best of her life, when each juror said out loud the word guilty. Where she sat, in her Laura Ashley-style blue and white sailor ensemble, she was careful not to react. But if you look closely, you could see her brown eyes glistening. It was only after Peterson was escorted away, destined to a life in prison, that she and Jim Harden hugged, and she afforded herself a smile. Later, some jurors would say that the gay stuff, the porn, even the suspicious death of Liz Ratliff, none of that factored into their verdict. It was all that blood. And blood, it didn't lie. Though I have to wonder if they'd learned about Clancy, he might have gotten the death penalty. As Freda Black basked in the glory of her big career win, there was another woman, halfway across the world, aghast at this shocking defeat. What had happened to Michael Peterson was a travesty, a gross injustice. And thankfully, she had the power to do something about it. To tell Michael Peterson's story as it really was, who he really was. Not through some corrupt American court, but through France's greatest art form. She'd tell the truth in film, one frame at a time. It was now winter once again in Paris. And by then the filmmakers, Jean and Denis, realized they had much more than a feature film. They had so much material from their time with Michael Peterson and the trial. They had over 500 hours of tape, that there was without a doubt a TV series here. But to help them make sense of all of that tape, they needed one of France's best editors and most passionate creators, and that was Sophie Brunet. Jean was the director, Denis was the producer, but it was Sophie, as the lead editor, who would dig into the hours and hours and hours of material and find the gems, the best moments, identify the story arcs, find those cliffhangers, and make sure the whole thing made sense. And somewhere throughout those hours and hours and hours, looking at Michael Peterson's face over and over again. Sophie didn't see what Freda Black saw. Through Sophie's eyes, Michael was a kind and smart and complicated man. And a man who'd gotten screwed by the American legal system. At the very least, she felt Michael deserved another chance, a better investigation, maybe even a retrial. She was so swept up in Michael's story, an incredible version of him that she actually created. She fell in love with her creation. And after the docuseries, Sophie would forge a relationship with Michael, writing him in prison. And eventually, she'd come to Durham to help him with his case, help him get justice. As always, justice wasn't about truth, but who told the better story. And back in 2003 in court, Freda Black and her boss Jim, they told the story that won. They got that guilty verdict. Jim Harden, he was the one that ended up on the cover of some lawyer magazine, not David Rudolph. But in the court of public opinion, the story that won was the Staircase's version of events, where suddenly it was Michael Peterson who was the hero. And Freda Black, she was like this big old, brassy, bigoted Southern bitch. In Durham, in real life, Freda Black was a star. Michael Peterson, that case was seen as a huge victory for her. And yet, after the Staircase, her career, which should have been straight to the top, instead took a few inexplicable and unfortunate twists and turns. As her boss, Jim Harden, left the district attorney's office to become a judge, Freda was asked to resign from the office in 2005 by his replacement. Maybe that was for the best, because for the next several years, Durham County District Court would be embroiled in a series of shocking corruption scandals, from the district attorney's office to the State Bureau of Investigations, including the condemnation of a certain blood expert named Dwayne Deaver, who withheld and falsified blood evidence to secure convictions. The kind of convictions that would lead to lifelong incarceration, even the execution of people who were potentially innocent. Now, Freda Black wasn't directly implicated in that behavior, but she was part of the whole culture. And she was accused of other questionable behavior, possible breaches of ethics, along with some self-destructive stuff like drinking and 2 DUIs from driving drunk. Jim Harden would later say that Freda Black was a fighter, and without her role in the DA's office, without something and someone to fight for, she faded away. With DUIs and personal problems and financial issues, Freda Black ended up giving up law altogether and working, at least for a time, at a local Durham dry cleaners. By her mid-50s, Freda appeared to be getting her life back together. She'd joined AA and was working on being sober, raising her teenage daughters and caring for her elderly father who had dementia. And the saga of Michael Peterson, at least her role in it, it was years ago, in the rearview mirror. That is, until 2018, when Netflix brought back The Staircase with new material. An epic, action-packed 13 episodes that spanned 2002 to 2017 that ended with his Alford plea. For millions of people who'd never seen The Staircase and their rage against Freda, Miss Pure Tea Filth, it was all anew and on an even bigger exponential scale. Millions and millions of people. A true crime tale that made her real life hell. In late July of 2018, that's just over a month after the Netflix series was released, Freda sent one of her daughters a strange and troubling text. Something about where she could find her will and how to get in touch with Freda's attorney. And when the daughter called police for a welfare check, Freda was found in her apartment, on the couch, surrounded by old wine bottles and trash. But her valuable items, her jewelry, and other mementos, they were all laid out neatly and carefully on her kitchen counter. And at first, her death had appeared as suicide, but it wasn't. According to her autopsy, she suffered from severe liver damage from chronic alcohol abuse. An end that is described somewhat euphemistically as natural causes. That was 2018, and I only wish that Freda could have held on longer, because justice was coming, at least for her. In 2022, when the Max version of The Staircase came out, Michael Peterson and David Rudolph and Jean-Xavier de Lestrade and Sophie Brunet, they were all furious. Because the versions of themselves on screen, it wasn't all entirely flattering. And they all insisted the truth, it wasn't like that. And they accused Antonio Campos of manipulating their lives to suit his narrative. And well, that wasn't fair. But for Freda, she might have seen a version of herself that she actually liked, played by one of the best performers of her time, Parker Posey. In a version of events that might be the last version of The Staircase we'll ever see. A version that might be the truest one yet. At least for now. Thanks again for subscribing to Dead Sleep and for listening to this wild and woolly version of The Staircase. I'll be back next week with an all-new episode, along with the release of Dead Sleep Naked. More episodes of just voice, no music or sound effects. So thank you for your subscription, and until next time, nighty-night.